When people ask what the worst time in history was to be born as a human, they often expect a single answer: a war, a plague, a collapse. History does not work in clean lines. Human suffering rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates. It layers itself. It becomes unbearable, not because of one catastrophe, but because everything fails at the same time: food, safety, meaning, trust, and hope. The worst time to be born is not defined only by death rate or violence. It is defined by how little control a human has over survival, and how little explanation exists for suffering. By that measure, some periods stand out not because they were brief, but because they trapped entire generations inside conditions they could neither understand nor escape. One such time occurred in the middle of the 14th century, during what later generations would call the Black Death. To be born in Europe or parts of Asia between 1347 and 1352 was to enter a world collapsing without warning. Children were born into households already marked by fear. Parents did not know what disease was, how it spread, or why it chose some and spared others. Medicine was powerless. Religion offered explanation but not protection. Entire families vanished within days. Villages emptied. Social bonds dissolved under the weight of terror. What made this moment uniquely cruel was not only death, but uncertainty without knowledge. People believed the air itself was cursed. Others believed God had turned against humanity. Some blamed minorities, strangers, or neighbors. Violence followed ignorance. To be born then was to inherit fear before language, to grow up surrounded by funerals instead of futures. Survival felt arbitrary, meaning collapsed alongside bodies. Yet, even this was not the deepest point of human vulnerability. Another contender emerged in the early modern period, during the transatlantic slave trade. To be born into certain bodies, in certain regions, meant being classified as property before being recognized as human. Millions were born into a system where violence was normalized, identity erased, and suffering rationalized through ideology. This was not chaos. It was order designed to dehumanize. Children were separated from parent, languages erased, names replaced, history reserved. What made this era especially devastating was its systematic nature. Suffering was not accidental. It was organized, justified, and maintained across generations. To be born enslaved was to be denied not only freedom, but the right to narrate one's own existence. Survival required submission. Resistance carried lethal consequences. Hope itself became dangerous. And yet, even here, humanity persisted, quietly stubbornly against impossible odds. But if one moment in history comes closest to representing the absolute worst conditions to be born into a human being, it may be the first half of the 20th century, particularly between 1914 and 1945. This period combined industrialized warfare, ideological extremism, economic collapse, and technological mass death in a way never seen before or since. To be born in this era was to grow up surrounded by instability. Childhood coincided with World War I, followed by economic devastation, followed by the rise of totalitarian regimes, followed by World War II. Entire societies were mobilized for destruction. Violence was no longer local. It was mechanized, bureaucratic, and rationalized. Genocide was planned with paperwork. Death was scaled. Children born into this world learned early that life could be interrupted without reason. Families were torn apart by borders that shifted overnight. States decided who was human and who was disposable. Propaganda replaced truth. Fear became policy. Survival depended not on morality, but on circumstances. What distinguishes this period is not only the scale of death, but the collapse of ethical certainty. People were forced to choose between complicity and annihilation. Silence became a survival strategy. To be born then was to inherit a world where institutions designed to protect humanity had become instrument of its destruction. And yet, history complicates even this judgment. Because the worst time to be born is not only measured by suffering, but by the absence of alternatives. In every era, humans endured unbearable conditions, but they also found ways to imagine futures beyond them. Even in the darkest moment, people wrought, loved, taught children, hid strangers, preserved dignity in silence. What history reveals is not that one era was uniquely unbearable, but that human vulnerability is constant. While human resistance or resilience is unevenly disturbed or distributed, the worst time to be born is always the moment when systems collapse faster than understanding can keep up. This realization reframes the question. Perhaps the worst time to be born is not behind us, but whenever humans forget that suffering is produced by structures, not fate, whenever inequality becomes normalized, whenever violence becomes abstract, whenever lives are reduced to numbers. History teaches that conditions can deteriorate rapidly when fear replaces empathy and power escapes accountability. It also teaches that survival alone is not the measure of a good life. Meaning matters, dignity matters, agency matters. To be born human is to inherit not only biology, but history. Every generation receives a world shaped by choices made before them. The worst times in history were not inevitable. They were constructed through decisions, silences, and indifference. And that is the final lesson. The worst time to be born is not defined solely by death or disease, but by how easily humanity is forgotten. When that happens, any era can become unbearable, which means the question is not only historical, it's ethical. Thank you very much for watching.